Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
All right, so we're diving back into the Ark of the Covenant mystery.
Yeah.
We already explored Billy Carson's take on it,
Yeah.
and now we're bringing in the Y-Files to see if they see eye to eye on this, or is it a completely different interpretation?
Yeah, it's a fascinating comparison, because both sources are looking at the Ark through this lens of technology.
Right.
Like they're both assuming that it wasn't just a sacred object or a religious artifact, but that there was some real technology behind it.
Okay.
But the technologies they propose and, ultimately what they think the Ark was actually for are really different.
Okay, so let's refresh on the Carson theory a little bit.
Right, yeah.
He's basically saying this was like a powerful energy source, maybe even like a weapon stolen from the Egyptians
Right.
by Moses, who he thinks was actually Akhenaten.
Right.
And he even points to the Great Pyramid as evidence.
Yeah, he does.
Saying, there's this huge chunk of granite missing.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty wild retelling of history.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Carson's theory is how much emphasis he puts on the Ark's power. Like he even talks about this professor who supposedly rebuilt the Ark
Really?
based on biblical descriptions, and it could shoot these powerful energy beams.
Whoa, okay, so like straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But does the Y-Files agree with that whole superweapon idea?
Not exactly. They explore the idea that the Ark could harness energy and discharge it.
Okay.
But their approach is a bit more nuanced. One of the technologies they propose is that it could have been a capacitor.
A capacitor?
Yeah.
How would that even work?
So basically, a capacitor stores electrical energy, and they point out that the Ark's construction, the layers of gold and wood,
Right.
could have created the right conditions for that. And this might explain why people died when they touched it in the Bible.
Oh, like they got electrocuted?
Yeah, exactly. Like a massive discharge of energy.
Wow, that's a pretty intense image.
It makes you think twice about touching it.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so capacitor. What else?
Well, they also suggest that it could have been a communication device.
Hold on, a communication device.
Yeah.
Like an ancient radio or something.
Exactly. They think maybe the cherubim figures on top
Mhm.
could have been like antennas transmitting radio waves.
So are we talking like messages from God here, or is this getting into like extraterrestrial territory like Carson was hinting at?
Well, that's the fun part. The Y-Files doesn't really take a side. They just kind of put the idea out there
Okay.
and let you, ponder the possibilities.
Okay, so capacitor, possible communication device.
Mm.
Anything else?
They also look into whether it could have contained radioactive materials. They bring up the destruction of Jericho and the weird illnesses that the Philistines got after capturing the Ark and wonder if, maybe radiation was involved.
Okay, so we got electricity, radio waves, maybe even nuclear power. Sounds like both sources are saying this thing was definitely packing some serious power.
Definitely. It wasn't just some ceremonial box.
Right.
There are those stories of Uzzah dying just for touching it. The priests taking all those precautions when handling it.
Yeah.
The Philistines getting tumors. It all paints a picture of an object that was both awe-inspiring and super dangerous.
Okay, so they agree on that much, but they don't really agree on where that power came from, right?
Right. There are some points of convergence, but the interpretations are pretty different.
So Carson's really focused on this stolen superweapon angle,
Yeah, he seems pretty set on that.
which ties into that whole dramatic retelling of history and the escape from Egypt,
Exactly.
whereas the Y-Files is more open to different possibilities.
Yeah, they're more interested in the how. Like, what were the actual technologies at play?
Okay, so Carson's focused on the what, and the Y-Files is looking at the how. But do they ultimately agree that the Ark had a technical purpose?
Yeah.
Like, is that the common ground here?
Well, that's the question we need to grapple with as we dig deeper.
No.
Both of them are definitely challenging the idea that this was just a purely religious relic. They're
Yeah.
saying there's a technological dimension. But the details of that technology and what it was actually used for are still very much up for debate.
So whose interpretation is more convincing? Are they both onto something, or are we getting into speculation territory here?
To answer that, we need to really break down the evidence they're using and think critically about their arguments.
Okay, so let's do it. Let's see what we can uncover.
Let's dive in. So let's look at the evidence each source is bringing to the table. Carson relies a lot on visual evidence, to support his idea about the Ark's destructive power.
Yeah, he's got that whole thing about the chunk of granite missing from the Great Pyramid.
Exactly. He connects that to the biblical descriptions of the Ark's power.
Okay.
And it creates this really compelling story.
Right.
But the Y files, they take a different approach. They're more focused on the Ark's construction, the specific materials used.
Yeah, like the gold and the wood?
Exactly.
Right.
They use that to back up their capacitor theory,
Okay.
saying that those materials could have stored and discharged energy. So both sources are drawing on biblical accounts and historical details, but the way they interpret that information is really different.
Yeah, and I guess that brings up the question of credibility. Are we dealing with solid research here, or is this more like speculation?
Yeah, that's a good point. So how do these sources stack up in terms of credibility?
What do you think?
Well, Carson's a great storyteller. He weaves together history and mythology. It's a captivating narrative.
Yeah.
But he often makes these leaps of logic, connecting things that might not actually be connected.
Right.
And he doesn't always back up his claims with strong evidence.
So maybe take his theory with a grain of salt.
A little bit of skepticism is always healthy, especially when you're dealing with claims that are so far out there.
Right.
The Y files, on the other hand, they take a more grounded approach. They present multiple theories, explain the science behind each one, and they're upfront about both the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments.
Yeah, they even debunk some of the more outlandish theories out there.
Exactly. They're not afraid to say, hey, this probably isn't true.
Which is refreshing.
Definitely. It shows they're committed to getting things right.
Okay, so it sounds like the Y files is the more credible source. But does that mean Carson is totally wrong? Could there be any truth to his idea about the Ark as this stolen weapon?
Well, it's tricky. His interpretation might be a bit out there.
Right.
But that core idea that the Ark had immense power, that's something that the Y files also acknowledges.
Okay.
They just have different explanations for where that power came from.
So instead of stolen Egyptian tech, the Y files is saying maybe it was a capacitor or a communication device.
Exactly.
Or maybe it even had radioactive materials.
Right. All of which could be incredibly dangerous in their own way.
For sure. So even though they disagree on the specifics, they both agree that this thing was not to be messed with.
Absolutely. It commanded respect and maybe even fear.
Which brings us back to the core question. Are they both essentially saying the Ark had a technical purpose?
Yeah. That's the crux of it. Both sources are pushing back against that traditional view of the Ark as a purely religious artifact.
Okay.
They're saying there was a technological element to it.
Right.
But the details of that technology and how it was used, those are still up for debate.
So what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, both sources touch on the disappearance of the Ark and where it might be now. And that's where things get even more intriguing. I mean, imagine if they actually found the Ark of the Covenant. That would be huge.
Yeah, we like finding a piece of alien technology or something. Who knows what secrets it could hold?
Right. It would completely change our understanding of history, especially the history of ancient civilizations.
And what about the impact on religion? I mean, this is a central symbol for both Judaism and Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. It would definitely spark some serious theological debates. And who knows? It could even change how people view their faith.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
And then there's the scientific side. Imagine scientists trying to figure out how this technology works. Could they replicate it?
And what if they could, think about the possibilities, but also the dangers.
Exactly. That's the big question. What if this technology fell into the wrong hands?
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Right. It could be used for good or for evil. Who would control it? How would we even keep it safe?
Yeah, it's kind of a scary thought. Maybe it's better if it stays lost.
Maybe. But even if it never turns up, just exploring these possibilities has been fascinating.
Yeah, it really makes you think. And it makes you question everything you thought you knew about history.
That's the beauty of these deep dives. They push us to think outside the box, to consider new perspective, and to never stop questioning.
So even though Carson and the Y files don't always agree, they both challenge us to see the Ark in a new light.
Right. It's not just a religious relic. It's a symbol of something much bigger. Something we might never fully understand.
And that's okay. Sometimes the mystery is part of the appeal.
Exactly. It keeps us curious. It keeps us searching for answers.
So what's the takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we should never stop exploring, never stop questioning, and never lose that sense of wonder.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Ark of the Covenant.
It's been a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. Until next time, folks, keep those minds open and keep exploring those mysteries.
If you enjoyed this episode of While We Were Distracted, be sure to watch the video that inspired it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.